January 18th, 1991, Belgrade, 03:12 a.m. Deep underground, behind 2 feet of concrete and a steel blast door, a Soviet radar advisor stared at a black screen. No contacts, no altitude, no threat code. Just silence. He leaned forward in disbelief, fingers tracing the edge of the CRT monitor as if willing it to respond. The bunker's low ceiling hummed with fluorescent lights. Coffee steamed beside an open binder filled with detection grid overlays. Every page in that binder was now worthless. Baghdad had just been hit. Not once, not in waves, but surgically. A dozen key sites, command bunkers, air defense hubs, communication relays, had been destroyed in under 5 minutes. There had been no audible approach, no radar track, no visual reports, just craters, fires, silence. The Soviet officer pressed rewind on the surveillance log feed and rewatched the radar screen during the moment of the strike. At the exact timestamp of the detonation, the scope remained blank, a full sweep, no returns. He froze the frame, enhanced it, isolated band echoes. Nothing. They flew through it, he muttered to himself, voice low, as if saying it too loud might make it real. They flew straight through the net. Beside him, a Yugoslav operator lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "Are you saying the Americans attacked Baghdad, and we didn't even see them?" The Soviet didn't answer. The radar site in Baghdad had been equipped with a P-18 spoon rest and a modernized SNR-125 system. Soviet-designed, layered, calibrated. It had detected Israeli raids, Iranian interceptors, even low-flying U-2s decades earlier. But now, it had failed to see anything. Half a world away in Moscow, scrambled reports were already being decoded from Soviet military attachés embedded with Iraqi forces. The picture was forming. The Americans had deployed a new aircraft, one that didn't jam radar, one that didn't fly fast, one that didn't even maneuver aggressively. It simply appeared, struck, and vanished, like a shadow stitched into the night sky. The Soviet officer stared at the blank log again, realization dawning in his chest like a cold, tightening grip. This wasn't electronic warfare. This wasn't deception. This was absence made into a weapon. A myth had just died in silence, not under gunfire, not in a dogfight, but beneath the whine of cooling fans and the blank stare of a radar screen that had never seen what killed them. In the inner sanctums of the Soviet air defense forces, confidence was religion. For over 3 decades, they had built, calibrated, and deployed the densest and most lethal integrated air defense systems, IADS, in the world. A wall of electromagnetic vision and destruction designed to detect, track, and kill anything that entered its range. From Siberia to East Germany, the doctrine was clear. Nothing could cross the net without being seen. And in theory, they were right. By 1990, the Soviet radar doctrine was a masterpiece of layered redundancy. Low-frequency early warning radars like the P-14 Tall King scanned wide arcs from hundreds of kilometers away. Mid-range search radars like the P-18 Spoon Rest handed targets off to tracking radars like the SNR-125 Low Blow or the P-15 Flat Face. Each layer had its weakness, but together they formed a seamless dome of detection. If an American aircraft came in low, it might evade early warning, but it would be seen by acquisition. If it jammed one band, another would switch frequency. If it maneuvered fast, tracking radars would predict its arc. A single aircraft might evade temporarily, but no strike package could go unnoticed. Every war game said so. Every test confirmed it. And then came Iraq. By 1990, the Iraqi IADS was arguably the most fortified Soviet-built air defense network outside the Warsaw Pact. It featured more than 2,000 radar sites, including modern systems like the P-18, P-12, and SNR-75, all hardened and layered. SA-2s, SA-3s, SA-6s, and ZSU-23-4 Shilkas formed concentric kill zones around Baghdad. Entire battalions of missile operators drilled twice weekly with live tracking exercises. The system was designed, advised, and certified by Soviet officers. The assumptions ran deep. Assumption number 1. Radar sees everything. Even stealth attempts can be detected at specific angles or altitudes. Gaps could be closed by sheer density. Assumption number 2. Low-frequency radar defeats stealth. The belief was that stealth aircraft were only invisible to high-frequency targeting bands, not to broader low-band surveillance. Assumption number 3. A multi-layered system cannot be breached. Even if one radar missed a target, the next would catch it. Enough layers meant immunity. But none of it mattered. The F-117 didn't jam. It didn't radiate. It didn't appear on long wave. It didn't reflect enough signal to register on shortwave. Its RCS, radar cross-section, was the size of a bird. In simulated detection ranges, it showed up as background noise. On January 17, 1991, that noise passed directly through the net, struck with impunity, and vanished before a single missile could be launched. And suddenly, every comforting theory inside that room, about angles, frequencies, overlapping coverage, and human vigilance, collapsed in a single agonizing fact. You cannot shoot what you cannot see. To grasp the scale of the failure, one must first understand what the Soviet Union believed about air defense, not in whispers or theory, but in codified bulletproof doctrine. For decades, Soviet planners had engineered their IADs to survive NATO's best. From the Fulda Gap to the Persian Gulf, the system they exported was grounded in the principle of saturation and resilience. Nothing got through unchallenged, not American cruise missiles, not Israeli strike packages, and certainly not manned bombers. The structure was meticulous. Early warning radar detected, acquisition radar classified, tracking radar painted the target, fire control systems executed. Each band of the electromagnetic spectrum was covered from VHF to X-band. If a radar blinked, another picked up the signal. If a missile battery was struck, a second was already reloading. If jamming came, alternate frequencies activated. It was a doctrine built to absorb punishment and still return fire. At its heart was the belief that air power, no matter how advanced, was visible. Every aircraft had a signature: thermal, acoustic, electromagnetic, or radar-based. With the right combination of systems and crews, that signature could be isolated and destroyed. The proof? Vietnam. In the 1970s, Soviet-designed SA-2 guideline missiles had shot down dozens of American jets. North Vietnamese crews, trained in Soviet doctrine, had bled the skies over Hanoi dry. In 1982, during the Lebanon War, the Syrians, armed with Soviet radar, inflicted losses on Israeli formations, even amid advanced ECM. The message was clear: Soviet radar wins wars, and so they exported it. To Libya, to Angola, to North Korea, to Iraq. Baghdad was the shining example: hardened bunkers, P-18 spoon rests, SNR-75 fan songs, and mobile SA-6 gainfuls. Interlocking fields of fire, radar coverage at multiple altitudes, optical backups, heat-sensing relays. It was a dome, thick, alive, and lethal. But here's what Soviet doctrine couldn't imagine: a weapon that didn't try to survive radar, but ignored it altogether. The F-117 wasn't just stealth-shaped. It was stealth-purposed, designed to absorb, scatter, and evade electromagnetic energy. Where traditional aircraft sought to minimize signature, the Nighthawk sought to become electromagnetic silence. It had no radar, no afterburner, no communication mid-mission. Its entire body was angular to redirect radar away from emitters. It didn't reflect, it deflected. And that was the fracture in the doctrine. Soviet planning relied on reflection, the idea that somewhere, somehow, radar energy would bounce back. That radar would always win if given enough time and frequency. But time was now a liability. The F-117 flew at subsonic speed, hugged blind corridors in the radar net, and used precise timing and mission programming. It arrived at windows of weakness with scientific precision. windows the Soviets didn't even believe existed. Worse, the American doctrine had shifted too. While the Soviets trained for mass wave defense, the U.S. trained for surgical incision. Fewer aircraft, cleaner strikes, complete confusion. And in that confusion, the F-117 operated not like a plane, but like a whisper, moving from absence to destruction, then back to absence. That wasn't just a tactical problem. It was the unraveling of the entire Soviet air defense identity. Baghdad, January 17, 1991. 2:38 a.m. Inside Iraq's most fortified radar command post, sirens blared. But the screens were blank. The first bombs detonated over downtown Baghdad. Not missiles, not cruise weapons, bombs. Precision-guided, deep-penetrating munitions that struck hardened bunkers, command centers, and communication hubs with clinical precision. Yet in the minutes leading up to the strike, no radar had seen incoming targets. Colonel Walid, a senior Iraqi air defense officer, shouted into a headset, "Where are the tracks? Where are the tracks?" Operators stammered. Some claimed radar interference. Others insisted the system was working fine. They had run diagnostics just 2 hours earlier. All radars were active. All systems were green. Still, no returns. And then, the second wave hit. More explosions lit the horizon. 8 high-value targets, each chosen with surgical care, erupted in fire. Radio towers snapped like matchsticks. Hardened bunkers folded inward. And the radar center itself lost uplinks to 5 of its outer nodes. But the most terrifying part? Not a single missile had been launched in defense. No SA-2s, no SA-3s, not even Shilka autocannons. The guns were silent because the sky was empty. Or so it seemed. When Soviet advisors in Baghdad reviewed the tapes that morning, they found a chilling pattern. The Iraqi IADS had operated correctly. It had scanned every corridor, every altitude layer, every rotation cycle. But at the exact moments of impact, nothing. The radar logs showed standard sweep patterns, no blips, no anomalies, no tracking errors, just void. The initial Soviet assumption was that jamming had occurred. Perhaps the Americans had unleashed a new electronic warfare system, one so powerful it completely shut down signal reception. But IL-NT, electronic intelligence analysis, quickly dismissed that. There were no bursts, no decoys, no spikes in frequency congestion. The frequencies weren't blocked. They were undisturbed, which meant one thing. Nothing was reflecting back. The F-117s had passed through the densest Soviet-designed radar grid outside Eastern Europe, without being seen even once. And this wasn't a fluke. This was by design. The attack route had been pre-mapped through known radar gaps. But even within radar coverage, the aircraft remained invisible. Their radar cross-section, 0.001 square meters, registered as atmospheric clutter. Rain, birds, debris. The F-117s had carried no ECM pods, no jammers, no radar. They emitted nothing. They flew on inertial navigation, entered timed corridors with minute-level precision, and struck only when sure the radars had swept away from their vectors. This wasn't air combat. It was an assassination. Worse, the mission logs from U.S. planners revealed a chilling phrase used to describe the success: uncontested penetration. For the Soviets, those 2 words echoed louder than the bombs. This wasn't just about radar anymore. This was about the death of deterrence. In Baghdad, every piece of gear, from the low-frequency P-18s to the mobile SA-6 gainfuls, had failed to see a single approaching aircraft, not because they were jammed, but because what had come to kill them didn't exist on their map of war. Back in Moscow, within the walled corridors of the Ministry of Defense, the first sitrep reports from Baghdad hit the table like a slap. No radar contact, no aircraft shot down. 8 strategic sites hit. All by aircraft we never saw. The generals stared in silence. Some scoffed. Others glared at the messenger as if the report itself was an insult. Marshal Biryukov of the Soviet Air Defense Forces was the first to speak. "Impossible. There must be an error. Either their jammers overwhelmed our systems or the Iraqis failed to activate engagement protocols. Denial wasn't just emotional, it was systemic. The idea that American aircraft could penetrate a layered Soviet radar net without even triggering an alert violated every known principle of air defense warfare. It challenged the very foundation of decades of doctrine. The first theory posited that this was a psychological operation, that perhaps the Americans had used UAVs or decoys to mask real ingress routes. Perhaps a low-level cruise missile strike had preceded the bombing, knocking out key radars in a silent first move. But signals intelligence quickly proved otherwise. No radars were disabled prior to the strike. The ground stations were active and reporting right up until, and after, the F-117s delivered their payloads. The second theory blamed the Iraqis, a familiar scapegoat. Their operators were poorly trained, the Soviet advisors said. Their doctrine was sloppy, their alertness questionable, but the truth emerged too fast for the lie to survive. The F-117s had also struck sites directly monitored by Soviet advisors. Soviet-trained personnel had been sitting at the consoles. They'd seen the data, they'd run the diagnostics, and they'd seen nothing. Soviet ILNT technicians attempted to salvage the narrative. They scoured radar telemetry for errors, glitches, noise artifacts. They found a few anomalies, irregular blips, atmospheric clutter spikes, but nothing conclusive. Nothing that could be tracked, let alone fired upon. Privately, a few engineers whispered a word most had hoped they'd never say out loud: stealth. Yes, the Americans had spoken of it for years. U.S. Air Force test programs had hinted at low observable designs since the 1970s. The F-117 itself had been seen, barely, during prior exercises. But Soviet analysts had dismissed it as an experimental gimmick. Unreliable, too expensive, not a threat in numbers. They were wrong. By the end of the week, 10 more F-117 sorties would strike Baghdad with the same eerie silence. No radar warning, no losses. Precision hits, deep in the heart of Soviet-built air defense zones. Still, Moscow hesitated to go public with the truth. In internal memos, officers clung to comforting phrases: new jamming methods, terrain masking, high-risk infiltration routes. But deep down, they already knew. This was not just an isolated mission. This was a systemic failure. The first open proof that Soviet eyes could no longer see the enemy. And the most terrifying part? The Americans already knew that, and came anyway. As the bombing campaign intensified, Soviet military theorists scrambled for an explanation that didn't involve a complete collapse of their doctrine. Their first fallback theory, scenario and the most comfortable, was that the Americans had perfected electronic countermeasures, ECM, to a level previously thought impossible. The logic went like this: if the radar network didn't detect aircraft, it must have been blinded. Perhaps U.S. aircraft deployed high-altitude jammers that overwhelmed the signal-to-noise ratio. Perhaps decoys were inserted first, false radar echoes that created phantom strike groups to distract Iraqi SAM batteries. Maybe even satellite jamming platforms in geostationary orbit had coordinated with airborne EW aircraft like the EF-111A Raven or EA-6B Prowler. On paper, it was plausible. The U.S. had long been a leader in ECM. Their Wild Weasel squadrons had disrupted SAM systems in Vietnam. Their E-3 AWACS and Rivet joint platforms could orchestrate a symphony of electronic deception. But one detail shattered the theory. The F-117 didn't carry jammers. It didn't even have a radar. Post-strike intelligence confirmed it. Pilots flew with inertial navigation only. They received no mid-flight corrections. They had no emissions to trace, no radar to ping, no ECM pods under the wings. They were flying blind, silent, and invisible. And that was the point. Worse, signal analysis from Iraqi listening posts confirmed that no significant jamming had occurred during F-117 strikes. In previous wars, jamming created signal bursts, wideband spikes, momentary blackouts, or reflected saturation. But Baghdad's scope logs remained clean. Not empty from interference, just empty. That left only one option. The aircraft were not being jammed. They were evading detection entirely. Still, Soviet commanders pushed the ECM theory. To them, it was better to believe they were blinded by technology than fooled by physics. Because if the F-117 was truly invisible to radar, it wasn't just an engineering marvel, it was a doctrinal time bomb. It meant that every radar-guided system in the Soviet arsenal had an expiration date. And the decoy argument didn't hold either. Initial reports speculated that the Americans had launched cruise missiles or drones ahead of the F-117s to confuse Iraqi defenders. The BQM-74 Chukar, for instance, could simulate strike aircraft signatures. But debris fields contradicted this. The first detected impacts came from 2,000-pound laser-guided bombs, not missiles. No debris from drones. No intercept trails. No enemy aircraft seen or heard. Just clean hits, perfectly timed. The hardest truth began to settle in. The F-117 hadn't needed deception. Its design, shaped by Lockheed's Skunk Works and tested in secrecy, scattered radar waves away from emitters. Its surface coating absorbed signal. Its airframe lacked corners and reflective edges. Even the canopy was coated to deflect radar. Every inch of the plane's geometry had a purpose: to disappear. And disappear it had. What remained was silence. Not just on the radar scopes, but in the strategy rooms of the Soviet General Staff, where belief in the old explanations was beginning to break. Because this wasn't electronic warfare. It was something far worse. It was engineered invisibility. When the electronic warfare theory collapsed, Soviet planners shifted to another desperate explanation. Perhaps the Americans hadn't used stealth aircraft at all. Perhaps these were low-flying conventional jets exploiting terrain masking, slipping between radar cones, hugging the ground, darting through valleys or urban clutter. After all, this was a known NATO tactic. The British Tornado and American F-111 had terrain-following radar and could fly at treetop height with devastating surprise. In past conflicts, such low-level tactics had thrown off radar lock-on, and maybe the F-117 wasn't the ghost. Maybe it was just another shadow using clever routing. This theory had its appeal. It suggested a fix. Radar coverage could be tightened at low altitude. More look-down radars could be deployed. SAMs could be repositioned to catch aircraft hiding below the horizon line. Training could be updated. But again, the data didn't match. Signals analysis from Baghdad during the first 3 nights of the campaign showed no altitude anomalies. The radar logs did detect low-flying cruise missiles and traditional strike aircraft in other sectors, all of which appeared on the scopes as expected. In contrast, the F-117 strikes occurred with no radar return at any altitude, including those zones already covered for terrain masking. Worse, infrared tracking teams posted on Baghdad rooftops, armed with Soviet-designed IR seekers meant to supplement radar in close combat, saw nothing. There were no heat trails, no engine signatures, no afterburners slicing through the night, only the distant rumble of explosions. Even acoustic detectors failed. One Soviet engineer in Baghdad, trained on multiband radar fusion, filed a chilling post-strike summary. No thermal, no acoustic, no electromagnetic footprint detected. These are not low-flying aircraft. They are beyond-spectrum vehicles. Still, desperate for a solution that made sense within existing doctrine, senior officers insisted the Americans must have flown through timing windows, moving between radar sweeps with near-impossible precision. But U.S. Air Force briefings leaked after the war proved otherwise. The F-117s didn't avoid radar through timing. They flew right through the heart of coverage zones, undisturbed and unseen. Their flight paths were not reactionary. They were dominating. And if that wasn't terrifying enough, American planners had anticipated the Soviet response. They chose routes that mocked radar saturation. They didn't avoid defenses. They demonstrated that the defenses were irrelevant. One Soviet radar chief, interviewed years later, recalled the moment that changed his thinking. During a debrief in late January 1991, he asked, "If they flew low, Where's the wake? The turbulence? The physical shock? An American analyst later answered in one phrase. They didn't fly low, they just didn't show up. It was a moment of reckoning. Because if low-flying conventional jets could be stopped with more radar, more missiles, more training, then stealth couldn't. Stealth didn't break the system. It made the system meaningless. What the Soviets had missed wasn't an altitude adjustment or a timing gap. It was the arrival of a new dimension in aerial warfare, one that operated not under their radar but outside their entire understanding of detection. By early February 1991, the internal mood within Soviet military intelligence had shifted from denial to dread. The General Staff convened an emergency analysis group within the GRU and the Scientific Technical Committee of the Ministry of Defense. Their goal: determine how this had happened. Not tactically, but structurally. How had the Soviet Union, with its vast network of spies, scientists, and analysts, completely failed to predict the arrival of an invisible warplane? The answer was devastating. The warning signs had been there, in fragments. Back in the late 1970s, a few whispers about an experimental U.S. program codenamed Have Blue had reached KGB channels. Analysts knew the Americans were testing strange, angular aircraft in the Nevada desert. By the early 1980s, satellite imagery had caught glimpses of unmarked airframes with bizarre shapes near Groom Lake. In 1988, blurry photos of a black, angular aircraft, soon dubbed the F-117, leaked into the Western press. U.S. defense publications speculated on stealth. One grainy image showed the jet taxiing at dusk. The Pentagon neither confirmed nor denied. But Soviet intelligence dismissed it all. Why? Because the doctrine said it shouldn't work. Stealth, according to Soviet technical committees, was a Western indulgence. Too fragile, too limited, too expensive. In a high-intensity war, mass and survivability would win. The F-117, they believed, could carry only 2 bombs. It flew subsonic. It had no radar. It was tactically blind. Why build a jet that couldn't dogfight, couldn't escort, and couldn't defend itself? They had underestimated the strategy behind it. The U.S. didn't build the F-117 to survive combat. They built it to never be in combat at all. Its survival wasn't based on speed or firepower, but on invisibility. And it wasn't meant to replace fighters. It was meant to surgically remove the eyes and ears of the enemy, command nodes, radar hubs, communication relays, and leave the rest of the battlefield blind. Soviet intelligence had misunderstood stealth as a feature. In truth, it was a doctrine. Worse, the Americans had designed an entire operational ecosystem around it. Satellite reconnaissance fed route planning. AWACS and rivet-joint aircraft provided theater-wide awareness. Tankers waited silently just outside detection range. And deep inside enemy territory, the F-117 flew alone, unaided, unescorted, and completely unchallenged. The implications were unbearable. Every Soviet investment in radar-guided missiles, from the venerable SA-2 to the mobile SA-6, suddenly felt archaic. If they couldn't see a bomber flying at 600 mph at medium altitude in open airspace, then what could they stop? The paranoia spread quickly. Was the B-2 bomber real? If so, could it carry nukes and bypass continental defenses? Were other stealth aircraft already flying over the USSR, mapping radar grids, testing weaknesses, logging responses? Even worse, had the Americans deliberately allowed the F-117 to be seen in 1988, just to lull Soviet intelligence into a false sense of superiority? The final blow came when Soviet agents inside Iraq reported a pattern. F-117 strikes were not random. They were systematic, targeting radar sites first, then SAM batteries, then command bunkers. Within 48 hours of the first attack, Baghdad's entire integrated air defense grid had gone dark. The network hadn't just been bypassed. It had been dismantled step by something it never saw. And in the smoky boardrooms of Soviet intelligence, the conclusion was now undeniable. They had not only failed to see the F-117 coming, they had failed to see the future. To the Soviets, the F-117 was an enigma. But in the halls of Lockheed's Skunk Works and within the precision machinery of the U.S. Air Force, it was something else entirely. A tool built not to dominate combat, but to erase it. The aircraft that humiliated the Soviet IADS wasn't fast, wasn't agile, and carried just 2 bombs. But it operated on a principle the Soviets had never fully accounted for: the complete manipulation of the electromagnetic spectrum. The key was radar cross-section, RCS. Traditional fighters had an RCS in the range of 5 to 15 square meters. The F-117, 0.001 square meters. That's smaller than a bird, smaller than a metal ball bearing. Its surface scattered radar waves into directions radar receivers didn't cover. Its skin absorbed remaining energy. Its engines were buried deep within the fuselage, with baffles to eliminate infrared and radar signature. The canopy was coated with indium tin oxide, making even the cockpit radar reflective. It didn't just avoid radar, it defeated the very physics radar depended on. But stealth was only the first half of the weapon. The second half was precision systems integration. Every F-117 flight was planned down to the second. Targets were loaded into an inertial navigation system guided by GPS, a technology the Soviets had underestimated. With no need to communicate mid-flight and no radar to betray it, the F-117 operated entirely in silence. Its pilots flew blackout missions using digital maps, fixed coordinates, and terrain profiles. Even re-entry corridors were calculated around radar blind zones. Meanwhile, the rest of the U.S. system functioned like a remote brain. AWACS didn't direct the F-117, but scanned enemy response. Rivet joint aircraft listened for SAM site chatter. Tankers loitered just outside IADS range, refueling the strike jets in the dark. If threats arose, EA-6B Prowlers or EF-111 Ravens jammed them, but only as a backup. The F-117 didn't rely on those systems. It was already inside the kill zone before enemy radar even lit up. Every strike was clockwork. Take the first wave over Baghdad. 8 F-117s took off hours earlier from Saudi Arabia. Each flew staggered ingress routes to avoid overlap. Each timed its arrival to coincide with radar sweep downtime. Bombs were released within seconds of schedule. Each target hit within a 3-meter radius. Then the jets turned, banked silently, and exited along an exfil corridor calculated days before. No flares, no chaff, no dogfighting, just surgical annihilation. The effect was psychological as much as physical. Iraqi radar operators began seeing ghosts. SAM crews launched missiles at nothing. Soviet advisors reported crew fatigue, panic, and phantom contacts, radar echoes created by their own fear. Some sites shut down their emitters entirely, preferring blindness over exposure. And that was the true genius of the American system. It didn't destroy enemy air defense with brute force. It made the enemy's eyes stop believing what they saw. In Soviet simulations, hundreds of aircraft were required to saturate an IADS. In practice, the U.S. showed that 8 invisible aircraft could do more damage in 20 minutes than an entire air wing in 1972. Worse, this system wasn't a fluke. It was the beginning of a doctrine, one that would evolve into the B-2, the F-22, and the entire concept of networked stealth warfare. The Soviets had built a castle wall. The Americans hadn't climbed it. They'd walked straight through it. And the castle still hadn't realized the war had already begun. The most devastating moment for Soviet radar doctrine didn't come in Moscow. It came in Baghdad. Night 3 of Operation Desert Storm, January 19th, 1991. F-117s launched another deep penetration mission targeting Baghdad's electrical grid, telecom hubs, and military command tunnels beneath the city. The Iraqis, reeling from 2 nights of silent devastation, were determined to respond. Soviet advisors, now fully embedded in key command centers, coordinated a desperate effort. Recalibrated radars, widened sweep ranges, backup infrared sensors deployed across rooftops. Everything was set to finally catch the invisible predators in flight. And then it happened again. Nothing. The F-117s came. They dropped their bombs with the same precision. Every target destroyed within minutes. Then they were gone. Not a single one was detected. Not a single missile launched. Not even a visual contact reported. This time, however, it wasn't just the destruction that shattered morale. It was what was found afterward. One of the first bombed sites, a hardened underground communications relay in Baghdad's Karada district, had been hit dead center by a 2,000-plow Duyazo GBU-27. Engineers measuring the crater noted a CEP, circular error probable, of less than 2 meters. The bomb had traveled over 500 miles, dropped from 25,000 feet by an aircraft no radar had seen, and hit a subterranean target shielded by reinforced concrete. Soviet-trained radar crews who visited the site were stunned. One officer reportedly said, "This is not warfare. This is surgery." Another more grimly, "We are blind mice, hunted by steel falcons." Then came the final humiliation. A captured American mission map was recovered from a downed aircraft. Not an F-117, but a support jet. It detailed ingress routes, SAM locations, and radar blind zones with pinpoint accuracy. The Soviets realized the Americans knew everything about the IADS, its geometry, rotation cycles, even operator shifts. The F-117 wasn't just invisible, it was invited. The phrase used in intercepted U.S. communications said it all. The doors are open. The Iraqis, under Soviet advisement, launched over 1,500 SAMs over the course of the war. 0 F-117s were shot down. 0. One radar operator, interviewed post-war under anonymity, recalled the horror in simple terms. "We saw the sky, then we saw fire. But we never saw the planes." In the Kremlin, the final internal report labeled it plainly: catastrophic systems breach, radar defeat by spectrum-absent aircraft. But what it really meant was this: everything the Soviet Union had built, the doctrines, the radars, the missile envelopes, the early warning nets, had failed to stop a single squadron of aircraft flying without support. Not because they were too fast, not because they were too many, but because they were never there to begin with. This wasn't just battlefield defeat. It was technological humiliation, broadcast globally in real time. And for the men who designed the so-called Impenetrable network, it was the moment they realized their empire's walls had already crumbled, before the war even started. By the end of Operation Desert Storm, the devastation in Iraq's air defense network was total. But the deeper collapse occurred far from the craters. It happened in the minds of Soviet strategists. The Soviet Union, still breathing its final months, had sold the myth of radar supremacy as one of its last reliable exports. In a world shifting beneath its feet, with Warsaw-packed nations peeling away and Eastern Bloc revolutions igniting, Soviet military hardware was supposed to be the one thing that still worked. It was their currency of relevance, their steel promise. And then came the F-117. It didn't just destroy airfields and bunkers, it dismantled belief. In classified after-action reviews, Soviet radar engineers were forced to confront the unthinkable, that decades of investment had been bypassed not by brute force, but by irrelevance. The layered air defense doctrine, SA-2s guarding SA-3s guarding SA-6s, backed by P-18s and mobile acquisition arrays, had failed to fire a single shot at the aircraft doing the most damage. The technology wasn't just outpaced, it had been leapfrogged, and ideology crumbled with it. For generations, Soviet doctrine taught that visibility equaled control, that anything detected could be destroyed. that mass radar arrays, overlapping fields of fire, and numerical advantage would outmatch Western agility. But stealth turned that equation on its head. Now, the most expensive Soviet systems, like the S-200 Angara or the prized S-300 prototypes, faced a silent killer they couldn't even acknowledge. An enemy that didn't fight radar but simply never showed up. The geopolitical ripple effect was immediate. In Hungary, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, military planners began reevaluating their air defense strategy. Confidence in Soviet-made systems eroded almost overnight. NATO countries watched the war unfold on CNN. And so did Warsaw Pact officers, many of whom saw their own weapons failing in a live-fire trial broadcast worldwide. When East German officers were interviewed in 1991 about the Soviet radar net, one admitted privately, "If Iraq is the dress rehearsal, we're already naked." Even inside Russia, post-Soviet defense circles quietly conceded that stealth had become the new currency of strategic dominance. Debates erupted over how long it would take to develop radar capable of detecting low RCS platforms. Theoretical proposals emerged for bistatic radar, multi-frequency fusion, and long-wave over-the-horizon detection. But these were answers for 10 years too late. Worse, the Americans knew it. The Pentagon made no effort to hide the F-117's performance. Its precision strikes were broadcast, footage of radar sites exploding without warning played on loop. And the nickname stuck: Ghost Jet. What the Soviets had tried to conceal, a doctrine in collapse, the Americans turned into spectacle. And the final irony? The F-117 was never meant to fight the Soviet Union directly. But in flying through Baghdad's Soviet-made radar grid, it delivered a strategic message to every general in Moscow. Your time has passed. Years later, long after the last F-117 mission and the quiet fall of the Soviet Union, a former radar officer sat in his modest apartment in Belgrade, rewinding an old VHS tape. The grainy footage showed a familiar scene: explosions in the Baghdad night, tracer fire launched skyward, air defenses blindly clawing at the sky. He paused the tape. No aircraft visible, no audio cue, just the silent detonation of a bunker that had taken years to design, gone in seconds. He leaned back, lit a cigarette, and whispered what he hadn't dared say in 1991. We were never ready. We were never even in the fight. The Cold War had trained men like him to believe in visibility, that the sky could be tamed with enough radars, enough missiles, enough math. That doctrine, like concrete, only needed reinforcement. But stealth had melted through it. Not like fire through steel, but like a ghost through fog. The F-117 didn't just break Soviet equipment. It exposed a deeper fracture, the collapse of imagination. While Soviet minds doubled down on detection, American engineers had asked a heretical question. What if we can make the plane disappear? And once that answer was airborne, everything else, intercept ranges, SAM coverage, radar towers, became irrelevant. The rules had changed, the game had ended, and no one had told the other side. Today, the F-117 is retired. Some sit in hangars, others in museums. But their legacy lives on in every stealth platform that followed. The B-2 Spirit, the F-22 Raptor, the F-35 Lightning. Not just aircraft, but ideas in flight, designed not to fight radar, but to erase themselves from it entirely. And in every defense command post where old radars still sweep the sky, there's a flicker of fear, because the ghost hasn't vanished. It's just gone back into the dark, waiting,